5 million members lost. That's not a projection. That's not a worst-case scenario. That's what actually happened to America's Lutheran churches in the past 40 years. 5 million people who were baptized Lutheran, confirmed Lutheran, raised their children Lutheran, and then left. In 1980, the two largest Lutheran denominations in America, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, combined had over 8 million members. Today, they have barely 3 million. That's a 62% decline. In one generation. A Lutheran pastor in Wisconsin told me about the Sunday morning that broke him. He'd been serving the same church for 23 years. A beautiful stone building built in 1887 by German immigrants who gave everything to establish a Lutheran witness in their town. That Sunday, he looked out at the sanctuary that could seat 300. 17 people were there. 17. The average age was 71. There were no children, no teenagers, no young families. After the service, the church council met. They'd been meeting every month for 2 years discussing the same question. How much longer can we keep the doors open? The building needed a new roof. $40,000 they didn't have. Their savings were almost gone. Within 6 months, they'd have to close. He said, I buried the people who built this church. I baptized their grandchildren. And now I'm going to be the one who turns off the lights for the last time. Multiply that scene across Lutheran America. Hundreds of churches closing every year. Congregations that survived the Depression, 2 world wars, and every cultural shift of the 20th century couldn't survive the 21st. Today, we're investigating the collapse of American Lutheranism. What caused the largest numerical decline of any Protestant denomination? Why churches that stood for centuries are closing at record rates? What both major Lutheran bodies got wrong? And what this reveals about the future of historic Christianity in America. If you want to understand one of the most significant religious shifts in American history, subscribe now. Because what's happening to the Lutherans is a warning for every traditional denomination. And your church might be next. To understand how catastrophic this is, you need to see the numbers in context. The Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA, was formed in 1988 through a merger of 3 Lutheran bodies. At its founding, it had 5.3 million members. Today, it has 2.9 million. That's a loss of 2.4 million members in 36 years. But the decline is accelerating. In the past decade alone, the ELCA lost over 800,000 members. That's not natural attrition from deaths. That's people leaving faster than the denomination can replace them. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, the LCMS, the more conservative Lutheran body, isn't doing much better. In 1980, they had 2.7 million members. Today, they have 1.8 million. That's a loss of 900,000 members. Combined, American Lutheranism has gone from 8 million to less than 5 million in 40 years. And the trajectory is getting steeper, not leveling off. Here's what makes this particularly devastating. Lutherans weren't a fringe movement. They were mainstream American Protestantism. Lutheran churches were in every small town across the Midwest. Lutheran colleges educated hundreds of thousands. Lutheran social services operated hospitals, nursing homes, and adoption agencies nationwide. This was institutional Christianity with deep roots, significant resources, and cultural influence. And it's collapsing. The closure rate tells the story. The ELCA closes approximately 150 churches per year. The LCMS closes about 50. That's 200 Lutheran churches shutting their doors every 12 months. 200 communities losing their Lutheran witness. 200 buildings being sold or demolished. 200 congregations that believed they'd last forever ending within a generation. But the numbers don't capture the human cost. Let me show you what's actually happening on the ground. Pastor Thomas's story, the last service. Pastor Thomas served a rural Lutheran church in Iowa. The congregation was founded in 1871 by Norwegian immigrants. For 150 years, it had been the center of community life. Weddings, funerals, baptisms, confirmations. Generations of families raised in that church. In 2023, they held their final service. 43 people attended. Most were in their 70s and 80s. They sang "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," Luther's great hymn. People wept. Pastor Thomas told me, these were people who gave their entire lives to this church. They taught Sunday school for 50 years. They served on every committee. They believed their grandchildren would worship here. And now they're watching it die. The grief is unbearable. After the final service, the building was sold to a developer who turned it into apartments. The cross was removed. The stained glass was sold. 150 years of Lutheran witness erased in an afternoon. Sarah grew up ELCA Lutheran in Minnesota. Baptized as an infant. Confirmed at 14. Attended Lutheran youth gatherings. She loved her church. In college, she drifted away. Not because of crisis or conflict. Just because the church didn't seem relevant anymore. The liturgy felt repetitive. The sermons were fine but not compelling. Her friends weren't going to church. She got busy. After graduation, she tried visiting Lutheran churches a few times. They were mostly elderly. The music felt dated. Nobody her age was there. She felt like an outsider in the tradition that raised her. She told me, I don't have anything against Lutheranism. I still consider myself Christian. I just don't see what the Lutheran Church offers that I can't get elsewhere or on my own. It feels like a relic from my grandparents' generation. Now she attends a non-denominational megachurch occasionally. She doesn't identify as Lutheran anymore, and she probably never will again. The declining seminary. Wartburg Theological Seminary, one of the ELCA's seminaries, tells the institutional story. In 1990, they had 200 students preparing for Lutheran ministry. Today, they have fewer than 80, and many of those won't end up serving Lutheran congregations because there aren't enough positions available. One professor told me, we're training pastors for a church that's disappearing. Every year, fewer students enroll because they see the statistics. Why go into debt for seminary when Lutheran churches are closing and the ones that remain can't afford full-time pastors? The professor said he sometimes wonders if he's teaching the last generation of Lutheran pastors in America. The merger that wasn't. In small towns across the Midwest, Lutheran churches from different synods that spent a century refusing to worship together are now merging out of desperation. ELCA and LCMS congregations that were theologically divided, sometimes literally across the street from each other, are combining because neither can survive alone. One merged congregation in South Dakota now has 17 members. They meet every other week because they can't afford a full-time pastor. They share their building with a community food bank to cover costs. A member told me, our grandparents would be horrified that we merged with the other Lutherans. But we didn't have a choice. It was merge or close. And even merged, I don't think will last 5 more years. This is the Lutheran collapse. Not abstract statistics, but real people watching their churches die. Communities losing institutions that anchored them for generations. A tradition that shaped American Christianity fading into irrelevance. Subscribe now if you're starting to grasp the scale of this crisis, because we need to understand how this happened. To understand the collapse, you need to understand what American Lutheranism was and why it thrived for so long. Lutheranism came to America with immigrants. Germans, Scandinavians, Finns, Slovaks. They brought their faith, their language, and their Lutheran identity. They settled primarily in the Midwest, Pennsylvania, and the Upper Midwest. For these immigrants, the Lutheran Church wasn't just a place to worship. It was the center of ethnic and cultural identity. The church preserved the German language, the Swedish traditions, the Norwegian heritage. Being Lutheran meant being part of a community that shared your background. Lutheran churches built schools so children could learn in their native language. They created social organizations, mutual aid societies, and cultural groups. The church was everything. This created incredibly strong Lutheran loyalty. You were born Lutheran, baptized Lutheran, married Lutheran, buried Lutheran. Leaving the Lutheran Church meant leaving your entire community and cultural identity. For generations, this model worked. Lutheran churches were packed. Lutheran colleges thrived. Lutheran institutions had massive influence. Lutheranism was one of the largest Protestant traditions in America. But this strength contained the seeds of collapse. Because Lutheranism was so tied to ethnic identity, it struggled when that ethnic identity faded. By the mid-20th century, assimilation was complete. Third and fourth generation Lutherans spoke English, not German or Swedish. They married outside their ethnic groups. They moved away from the tight-knit Lutheran communities. The cultural glue that held Lutheranism together dissolved. And many Lutheran churches didn't know how to be Lutheran without the ethnic identity. In 1988, 3 Lutheran bodies merged to form the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. The merger was supposed to create a strong, unified Lutheran witness. Instead, it accelerated the decline. The ELCA from the beginning leaned progressive. The merger documents emphasized social justice, inclusivity, and engagement with modern culture. Many saw this as faithful adaptation to changing times. Others saw it as compromise with secular values. Through the 1990s and 2000s, the ELCA moved left on social issues. In 2009, the denomination made a watershed decision. They voted to allow congregations to recognize same-sex relationships and to allow partnered gay and lesbian individuals to serve as clergy. The vote was close. 68% in favor, 32% opposed. But it fractured the denomination. Conservative ELCA churches and members were devastated. They believed the denomination had abandoned biblical authority. Many felt betrayed by leadership that they believed had steered the church away from historic Christianity. Over the next decade, approximately 600 ELCA congregations left to form a new Lutheran denomination, the North American Lutheran Church. Thousands more members simply left organized Lutheranism entirely. But here's the crucial point. Even as the ELCA moved progressive to attract younger, more liberal Christians, it didn't work. The hoped-for influx of progressive Christians never materialized. Young progressive Christians weren't looking for a progressive Lutheran church. If they were religious at all, they went to non-denominational churches or stopped attending entirely. Progressive theology didn't make the ELCA grow. It just accelerated the loss of traditional members without replacing them. The ELCA made a bet that embracing progressive positions would make them relevant to modern Americans. They lost that bet catastrophically. Membership has declined every single year since the 2009 decision, with losses accelerating rather than slowing. Meanwhile, the congregations that left to form more conservative Lutheran bodies took significant financial resources with them. Properties, endowments, active members who gave generously. The ELCA was left smaller, older, and financially weaker. You might think the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, the conservative Lutheran body, would be thriving while the ELCA declined. You'd be wrong. The LCMS maintained traditional theology. They opposed women's ordination. They held to biblical inerrancy. They rejected the progressive shifts that fractured the ELCA. But they're declining almost as fast. Why? Because theological conservatism alone doesn't create growth. The LCMS avoided the ELCA's progressive controversy, but they didn't solve the underlying problems facing all of Lutheranism. The LCMS has struggled with rigid traditionalism. Many LCMS churches are locked into worship styles from the 1950s. Liturgy done exactly as it's always been done. Hymns from centuries ago. Resistance to contemporary music or informal worship. This preserved Lutheran identity but made the churches feel like museums to younger generations. People visiting LCMS churches often describe them as cold, formal, and unwelcoming to outsiders who don't know the liturgy. The LCMS also became increasingly insular. LCMS Lutherans often view themselves as the faithful remnant preserving true Lutheranism while everyone else compromises. This creates strong identity among existing members but makes evangelism nearly impossible. One LCMS pastor told me, "We're so focused on being distinctly Lutheran and maintaining our theology that we forgot how to reach people who aren't already Lutheran. We preserved the faith but lost the mission." The LCMS is also dealing with demographic collapse. Their membership is overwhelmingly elderly. Young families are rare. When older members die, there's no one to replace them. And unlike the ELCA, which at least has some young progressive clergy, the LCMS struggles to attract seminary students. Who wants to serve dying rural congregations that can barely afford a pastor's salary? But the theological and cultural issues are symptoms of deeper structural problems that both Lutheran bodies share. Lutheranism is built on a strong denominational identity. You're not just a Christian or even just a Protestant. You're a Lutheran. You attend Lutheran churches. You support Lutheran institutions. But Americans, especially younger Americans, don't think denominationally anymore. They choose churches based on worship style, preaching quality, programs for their kids, and whether they feel welcomed. Denomination is irrelevant. Both the ELCA and LCMS spent enormous energy fighting over what it means to be properly Lutheran, while the people they were trying to reach didn't care about being Lutheran at all. For generations, people were Lutheran because their family was Lutheran and their community was Lutheran. That social pressure and cultural identity kept people in Lutheran churches even when they weren't personally committed. That's gone. Third and fourth generation Lutherans feel no ethnic tie to Lutheranism. They don't speak German or Swedish. They didn't grow up in tight-knit Lutheran communities. Being Lutheran means nothing to their identity. Without ethnic identity, Lutheranism has to compete on the religious marketplace. And it's losing badly. Lutheran worship is highly liturgical, formal, structured. For people raised in it, it's beautiful and meaningful. For outsiders, it's intimidating and inaccessible. Contemporary Americans, especially younger ones, prefer informal, emotionally engaging worship. They want to feel something. They want music they recognize. They want preaching that's practical and relevant. Lutheran liturgy offers depth, history, and theological richness. But it doesn't offer emotional accessibility. And in a culture that prioritizes feeling over thinking, Lutherans are at a massive disadvantage. Ask a Lutheran what Lutheranism is for, and they'll tell you about theology, justification by faith, the sacraments, the distinction between law and gospel. Ask them what Lutherans are doing in the world, and the answer is much less clear. Social services, yes, but so are many groups. Soup kitchens, food banks, standard charity work. Lutherans have theology but lack a compelling mission that motivates sacrifice and attracts new members. Without mission, institutions decline no matter how good their theology is. Subscribe now if you're seeing how multiple failures compounded into catastrophic decline, because we need to examine what this collapse reveals about American Christianity. The Lutheran collapse destroys the idea that right theology automatically produces healthy churches. Both the ELCA and LCMS have sophisticated theology. Luther's insights on justification by faith are profound. Lutheran sacramental theology is rich. Lutheran biblical interpretation is serious and scholarly. But theology didn't prevent collapse. The ELCA's progressive theology didn't attract new members. The LCMS's conservative theology didn't either. This reveals something crucial. People don't choose churches primarily based on theology. They choose based on whether the church meets their needs, whether they feel welcomed, whether their kids want to go, whether the worship resonates with them. Theology matters enormously for what the church believes and teaches, but it's not sufficient for institutional health. Many Lutheran leaders, especially in the LCMS, believed that if they just maintained correct doctrine, people would come. They were wrong. Correct doctrine with irrelevant ministry produces empty churches. The lesson isn't that theology doesn't matter. It's that theology alone isn't enough. Churches need theology plus mission, plus cultural engagement, plus accessibility, plus compelling worship. Lutherans had theology. They lacked almost everything else. The ELCA's trajectory is one of the clearest case studies in American Christianity. They embraced progressive positions on sexuality, gender, social justice, and biblical interpretation. They believed this would make them relevant to modern Americans and would attract younger, progressive Christians. It failed completely. Every year since moving progressive, the ELCA has declined. The pace of decline accelerated after 2009. The progressive pivot didn't bring growth. It just alienated traditional members without attracting new ones. Why? Because progressive Christians who care about church already have options. There are progressive Episcopal churches, progressive Presbyterian churches, progressive Methodist churches. The ELCA didn't offer anything unique. And most progressive Americans aren't looking for a church at all. They've abandoned organized religion entirely. Making Lutheran theology more progressive didn't change that. Meanwhile, the ELCA lost the people who actually attended Lutheran churches, traditional, older Lutherans who took biblical authority seriously. They left for the LCMS, for non-denominational churches, or stopped attending. The ELCA made a catastrophic miscalculation. They traded their existing base for a progressive audience that never showed up. Other mainline denominations should learn from this. The progressive path doesn't lead to renewal. It leads to faster decline. But before conservative Christians celebrate, look at the LCMS. The LCMS maintained biblical authority. They held conservative positions on sexuality, gender, and biblical interpretation. They did everything progressives criticized the ELCA for abandoning, and they're declining almost as fast. Why? Because cultural conservatism and theological orthodoxy aren't sufficient for growth either. The LCMS preserved Lutheran identity but failed at mission. Conservative churches that are growing in America, the Southern Baptists before their recent decline, the non-denominational megachurches, the Pentecostal movements, share certain characteristics. Accessible worship, strong preaching, clear mission, contemporary music, and cultural engagement. The LCMS has orthodoxy but not accessibility. Theology but not mission. Tradition but not relevance. This reveals that the culture war framework, progressive versus conservative, isn't actually the main issue. Both progressive and conservative Lutherans are declining because both failed to address the deeper problems: irrelevance, inaccessibility, and lack of compelling mission. The debate over sexuality was a symptom, not the cause. Lutheran decline began before the 2009 ELCA decision and continued in both directions afterward. American Lutheranism was built on ethnic identity. German Lutherans, Swedish Lutherans, Norwegian Lutherans. The Church preserved language, culture, and community. This worked for 3 generations. Then it catastrophically failed. By the 4th generation, ethnic identity had faded. Lutheran descendants didn't speak the old languages, didn't care about preserving ethnic traditions, didn't feel connected to communities their great-grandparents built. The Church became just another religious option. And when forced to compete on religious merit alone, without the cultural glue of ethnic identity, Lutheranism lost. This is a warning to every ethnic church in America. First-generation immigrant churches thrive. Second-generation churches do well. Third generation starts to struggle. Fourth generation collapses. If your church identity is primarily ethnic, you have maybe 60 years before catastrophic decline. Unless you transition to a compelling religious identity that transcends ethnicity, your church will die with the last generation that cares about the old country. Lutheran failure to make this transition is a case study in what not to do. They held on to ethnic identity too long, then tried to shift but had no compelling alternative identity to offer. Subscribe now if these revelations are challenging your assumptions about why churches grow or decline, because we need to talk about whether there's any hope for Lutheranism. Is Lutheran collapse inevitable, or could there be renewal? Let me offer honest analysis. For renewal to happen, several things would need to change dramatically. First, Lutheran churches would need to prioritize mission over identity preservation. The question can't be, how do we stay Lutheran? It has to be, how do we make disciples of Jesus Christ? If Lutheran distinctives serve that mission, keep them. If they hinder it, adapt. This would be controversial. Many Lutherans believe Lutheran theology is so important that compromise means abandoning the faith. But there's a difference between abandoning theology and making it accessible. Second, Lutheran worship would need to become accessible to outsiders. This doesn't mean abandoning liturgy entirely, but it means offering worship options that meet people where they are. Contemporary services alongside traditional. Multiple styles in one church. Some Lutheran churches are doing this. They're thriving. Most aren't. They're insisting that people adapt to Lutheran worship rather than adapting worship to reach people. Third, Lutherans would need a compelling mission. Theology alone doesn't motivate people. Vision does. What are Lutherans trying to accomplish? Why does Lutheran Christianity matter? What difference does it make? Without clear answers, people will continue leaving for churches that have compelling vision. Fourth, both Lutheran bodies would need to stop fighting culture wars and start focusing on gospel proclamation. The ELCA spent enormous energy on progressive advocacy. The LCMS spent enormous energy fighting progressive advocacy. Both lost focus on evangelism and discipleship. Churches that grow aren't those that win culture war debates. They're those that introduce people to Jesus and help them follow him. Here's my honest assessment. American Lutheranism will not recover its mid-20th century size or influence. That ship has sailed. The demographic trends are too severe. The cultural conditions that allowed ethnic churches to thrive are gone. The institutional infrastructure is collapsing too quickly to reverse. Best case scenario, Lutheranism stabilizes at a much smaller size. Perhaps 2 million combined members in the ELCA and LCMS by 2040. They become a smaller, more committed remnant. The churches that survive will be those that successfully transition from ethnic identity churches to mission-focused churches. Those that make worship accessible while maintaining theological substance. Those that find compelling reasons to be Lutheran beyond, our grandparents were Lutheran. Many churches won't make that transition. We'll see hundreds more closures, more mergers out of desperation, more beautiful stone buildings sold and converted to apartments or breweries. Lutheran institutions will continue contracting. Seminaries will merge or close. Lutheran colleges will drop Lutheran identity to survive. Lutheran social services will become secular nonprofits. Lutheran denominational structures will shrink dramatically. National church offices will cut staff. Regional judicatories will consolidate. The institutional church that took 2 centuries to build will be dismantled in 50 years. This isn't pessimism. It's realism based on trajectory and demographics. But the Lutheran collapse offers lessons for every denomination. Lesson 1. Ethnic identity expires. If your church is built on ethnic or cultural identity, you have 1 generation, maybe 2, before catastrophic decline. Start transitioning now to a compelling religious identity that transcends ethnicity. Lesson 2. Denominational loyalty is dead. Younger Christians don't care about denomination. They care about whether the church helps them follow Jesus. Stop expecting loyalty to your denominational brand and start earning people's commitment through excellent ministry. Lesson 3. Theology isn't sufficient. Right doctrine matters enormously, but without accessibility, compelling mission, and cultural engagement, right doctrine produces empty churches. You need theology plus everything else. Lesson 4. Neither progressive nor conservative guarantees success. The ELCA went progressive and declined. The LCMS stayed conservative and declined. The issue isn't theological direction. It's relevance, mission, and accessibility. Stop fighting culture wars and start making disciples. Lesson 5. Don't wait for demographics to force change. Lutheran churches waited until they were dying to consider adapting. By then it was too late. Adapt from strength, not desperation. Lesson 6. Buildings aren't the church. Lutherans loved their beautiful buildings. Many stayed open long past viability because people couldn't imagine closing. But maintaining buildings while the congregation dies serves no one. Be willing to let go of property to focus on people. Lesson 7. Institutional preservation is the enemy of mission. Both Lutheran bodies spent enormous energy preserving institutions. Seminaries, publishing houses, camps, administrative structures. They protected the institution while the church died. Mission must trump institutional preservation. 0.5 million embers lost in 40 years. 200 churches closing every year. A tradition that survived the Reformation, shaped the Protestant movement, and built American Christianity in the Midwest is collapsing before our eyes. And most Christians don't even know it's happening. The Lutheran collapse is a tragedy, not just for Lutherans but for all of Christianity. We're losing theological depth, liturgical richness, and institutional wisdom that took centuries to develop. But it's also a warning. What happened to the Lutherans is happening across mainline Protestantism. The Presbyterians are next. The Methodists are already there. The Episcopalians are further along. Historic Protestant Christianity in America is in catastrophic decline, and the churches that refuse to learn from Lutheran failures will repeat them. Here's what breaks my heart. Lutheran theology has so much to offer: justification by faith, the centrality of grace, serious biblical interpretation, rich sacramental life. This isn't theology that deserves to die. But theology doesn't preserve itself. Institutions don't maintain themselves. Churches don't perpetuate automatically. Every generation must choose to pass on the faith, must adapt to reach new people, must prioritize mission over preservation. Lutherans forgot this. They assumed their churches would last because they'd always been there. They protected tradition instead of pursuing mission. They preserved identity instead of making disciples. And now their churches are closing at rates that would have been unthinkable 50 years ago. If this investigation challenged you, opened your eyes, or made you think about your own church's future, subscribe now. Share this with church leaders who need to understand what's coming. Because the Lutheran collapse isn't about Lutherans. It's about what happens when churches stop adapting, stop reaching people, and assume institutional momentum will carry them forward. Every church is one generation from extinction. Every denomination is 3 generations from irrelevance. The question isn't whether change is necessary. The question is whether we'll change in time. The Lutherans waited too long. Their collapse is accelerating. And barring dramatic renewal, American Lutheranism as we've known it will be functionally extinct within 30 years. May we learn from their failure. May we prioritize mission over preservation. May we adapt to reach people instead of expecting people to adapt to us. That's not compromise. That's faithfulness. Because the gospel doesn't change, but methods must. The Lutherans forgot that, and now we're watching the consequences. Don't let your church make the same mistake.